I've been staring at this map for weeks, not because it's beautiful, but because once you notice what's happening, it becomes impossible to ignore. At the very top of Africa sits Morocco, a country most people associate with tourism, cities like Marrakesh or Casablanca, and little else. But that surface-level image hides something much more strategic unfolding beneath it. Over the last few years, Morocco has been quietly building massive infrastructure at an unusual pace. World-class stadiums, expanded ports, modernized airports, Africa's first high-speed rail line. At first glance, it looks like preparation for football tournaments. But countries don't spend billions for sports alone. They do it to reposition themselves economically and geopolitically. The explanation begins with geography. Morocco sits at the crossroads of three worlds: Europe to the north, the Middle East to the east, and sub-Saharan Africa to the south. It has coastlines on both the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, controls access to the western entrance of the Mediterranean, and lies less than 10 miles from Europe at the Strait of Gibraltar. On clear days, Spain is visible from Moroccan shores. For thousands of years, this location made Morocco one of the most important transit zones on Earth. Trade routes carrying gold, salt, goods, and ideas from Africa converged here before moving into Europe and the wider Mediterranean world. Empires passed through Morocco not by accident, but because geography demanded it. That advantage faded in the modern era. As Europe industrialized and Africa fell under colonial control, Morocco's position became a liability instead of a strength. In 1912, France invaded and turned Morocco into a protectorate. Although the monarchy remained, real power shifted to French administrators who controlled ports, taxes, land, and resources. Morocco was reorganized for extraction. Phosphates were mined. Agriculture was optimized for export. Infrastructure served colonial interests rather than local development. European settlers controlled vast areas of the most fertile land, while Moroccans were pushed to the margins of their own economy. During the World Wars, tens of thousands of Moroccan soldiers were sent to fight and die for European powers, even as Morocco itself remained under foreign rule. That contradiction created deep resentment and political awakening. By the mid-20th century, independence movements spread across Africa, and Morocco followed the same path. But unlike many newly independent states, Morocco did not experience immediate collapse, military coups, or institutional breakdown. The monarchy survived, providing continuity at a moment when many countries lost it. When Morocco gained independence in 1956, it did not sever ties with Europe or dismantle its administrative system overnight. Instead, it chose stability, gradual reform, and strategic patience. That decision shaped everything that followed. What we are seeing today is not sudden ambition, but the result of decades of long-term planning. Morocco is not trying to dominate Africa through size or force. It is positioning itself as the connector between continents, the logistical bridge between Europe and Africa, and the stable platform where capital, goods, and people can move efficiently. Once you understand that, Morocco's investments stop looking random. The ports, railways, airports, and stadiums are not isolated projects. They are pieces of a larger strategy built around geography, stability, and timing. Morocco is not the biggest economy in Africa, nor the most populous country, but it occupies one of the most strategically valuable positions on the map. And in the modern global economy, countries that connect regions often wield more influence than those that simply dominate territory. Colonial rule, independence, and why Morocco did not collapse. When France took control of Morocco in 1912, it did not erase the monarchy. Instead, it ruled through it. The Sultan remained on the throne, but real authority rested with French administrators who controlled taxation, land ownership, ports, and trade. On paper, Morocco was protected. In reality, it was managed for extraction. French rule reshaped Morocco's economy around colonial needs. Ports were expanded to ship raw materials to Europe. Phosphate deposits, among the largest in the world, were mined aggressively. Agriculture was reorganized to serve European markets rather than local food security. By the mid-20th century, European settlers controlled a disproportionate share of Morocco's best farmland, despite being a small minority of the population. Urban space reflected this imbalance. Cities like Casablanca and Rabat were redesigned with wide boulevards, modern infrastructure, and European architecture for colonial settlers. Moroccan neighborhoods were pushed outward, overcrowded, and underinvested. Economic opportunity was divided sharply along colonial lines. Moroccans were also drawn into Europe's wars. During World War I and World War II, tens of thousands of Moroccan soldiers were deployed to fight for France. Many died on European battlefields. Their sacrifice was praised when convenient and forgotten afterward. This deepened resentment and strengthened nationalist identity. After World War II, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. Europe spoke of freedom and self-determination while maintaining colonial rule abroad. In Morocco, political movements began to organize around independence, most notably the Istiqlal Party, which demanded full sovereignty and an end to French control. France responded with repression. Political leaders were arrested. Protests were crushed. In 1953, the French authorities made a critical miscalculation by exiling Sultan Muhammad V, a figure widely respected not only as a political leader, but also as a religious symbol of unity. He was replaced with a compliant ruler, but the move backfired immediately. Public anger exploded. Resistance spread across cities and rural areas. Riots, strikes, and armed attacks intensified. France now faced unrest in Morocco while already fighting a costly and brutal war in Algeria. Maintaining control over both became unsustainable. In 1955, France reversed course. Sultan Muhammad V was allowed to return from exile. His return triggered massive public celebrations and unified nationalist factions. Within months, negotiations accelerated. On March 2, 1956, Morocco officially regained its independence. This moment is where Morocco diverged from many post-colonial states. Independence did not lead to the abolition of existing institutions or violent power struggles. The monarchy remained intact, the bureaucracy continued functioning, foreign relationships were not abruptly severed. Instead of radical rupture, Morocco chose continuity. The leadership understood that sudden isolation or ideological extremism would weaken the country. Economic ties with France were preserved. Diplomatic relations with Western and Arab states were balanced carefully. Morocco positioned itself as non-aligned but pragmatic. At independence, Morocco was poor. Literacy rates were extremely low. Life expectancy hovered around the early 40s. The economy depended heavily on agriculture and raw material exports. But unlike many countries starting from similar conditions, Morocco prioritized state stability over rapid political experimentation. Sultan Mohammed V, now king, focused on consolidating authority, maintaining unity, and avoiding military coups. When he died in 1961, power passed smoothly to his son, Hassan II. That peaceful succession was rare in the region and would prove decisive. While other newly independent states experienced revolutions, counter-coups, and prolonged instability, Morocco remained politically intact. This stability came at a cost, including limited political freedoms, but it allowed the state to plan long-term. Morocco did not try to become powerful overnight. It focused on surviving, consolidating, and positioning itself carefully in a world shaped by Cold War rivalries and post-colonial uncertainty. That patience would later become one of its greatest strategic advantages. The long game under King Hassan II and the foundations of modern power. When King Hassan II took the throne in 1961, Morocco stood at a dangerous crossroads. Across Africa and the Middle East, newly independent states were collapsing into coups, revolutions, and ideological experiments. Militaries were seizing power, monarchies were falling, borders were unstable, economies were fragile. Hassan II understood something early. Morocco's greatest weakness was not poverty, it was unstable. And instability destroys nations faster than anything else. So his strategy was simple but unforgiving: preserve the state at all costs. Hassan II ruled Morocco for 38 years, from 1961 to 1999. His reign was not gentle. Political opposition was tightly controlled. Dissent was monitored. Periods of repression, later remembered as the Years of Lead, left long-lasting scars on Moroccan society. But while this period is controversial, it cannot be separated from the regional context in which it occurred. During the same decades, Algeria experienced repeated political crises and civil war. Libya collapsed into authoritarian chaos. Egypt oscillated between revolution and military rule. Iraq and Syria descended into cycles of violence. Many African states fell into coups that never ended. Morocco did not. There was no military takeover, no civil war, no fragmentation of the state. From a geopolitical perspective, Hassan X achieved something rare: continuity. Hassan X also understood Morocco's limits. The country had no oil, no gas, no massive population advantage. It could not project power through force or wealth. Instead, Morocco would project reliability. The king positioned Morocco as a predictable partner in an unpredictable region. Relations with France remained strong, despite the colonial past. Morocco cultivated close ties with the United States, becoming one of Washington's most consistent allies in North Africa. At the same time, Hassan II maintained strong links with Saudi Arabia and Gulf monarchies, securing financial support and diplomatic backing when needed. Morocco avoided ideological extremes. It did not fully align with socialism or radical nationalism. It did not reject the West or fully submit to it. This balance allowed Morocco to survive shifts in global power from the Cold War into the post-Cold War era. Economically, Hassan II focused on slow consolidation rather than dramatic reform. One of the most important decisions was retaining national control over phosphates. Morocco possesses the world's largest known phosphate reserves, a resource essential for fertilizer and global food production. Instead of privatizing or surrendering control, the state expanded OCP Group into a national champion. This decision would later become one of Morocco's greatest strategic assets. Infrastructure development during this period was gradual but intentional. Roads expanded between major cities. ports were upgraded. Administrative systems became more functional. The state did not grow quickly, but it grew sturdier. Education expanded unevenly but steadily. Literacy rates rose, universities developed, a basic professional class emerged. These investments did not produce immediate prosperity, but they created capacity. Perhaps most importantly, Hassan II preserved the monarchy as a unifying institution. In Morocco, the king was not just a political leader, he was also commander of the faithful, a religious role that tied political authority to spiritual legitimacy. This helped prevent the rise of radical movements that destabilized other countries in the region. By the 1990s, Morocco was not rich. Many Moroccans were still poor. Unemployment was high. Rural areas remained underdeveloped. But the state itself was intact, functioning, and internationally connected. That mattered. Because when Hassan II died in 1999, something extraordinary happened in the African and Arab context. Power transferred peacefully. No tanks in the streets, no generals declaring martial law, no emergency rule. His son, Mohammed VI, assumed the throne smoothly at the age of 36. This moment marked the end of Morocco's survival era and the beginning of its transformation era. Morocco had survived the most dangerous decades of post-colonial history. It had avoided collapse, coups, and fragmentation. Now it faces a different challenge: what to do with stability. King Mohammed VI, the Africa pivot, and the strategy nobody was watching. When King Mohammed VI took the throne in 1999, Morocco was stable but unspectacular. The country had survived where many others failed, yet it remained economically modest, heavily dependent on Europe, and largely absent from continental leadership. Most observers assumed Morocco would simply continue managing decline carefully. Mohammed VI saw something different. He looked south. For decades, Morocco's strategic focus had been almost entirely northward toward Europe and eastward toward the Arab world. Sub-Saharan Africa was viewed as distant, unstable, and economically risky. Many Moroccan elites barely considered it relevant. That assumption became the king's opening. At the turn of the millennium, Africa was changing quietly. Population growth was accelerating. Urbanization was exploding. Telecommunications were leapfrogging fixed infrastructure. Banking penetration was minimal, meaning whoever arrived first could shape entire markets. Yet Western capital remained cautious, and China had not yet fully deployed its continental strategy. Morocco moved early. Instead of dramatic announcements, the king launched dozens of state visits across West and Central Africa. Not symbolic trips, but deal-focused diplomacy, trade agreements, banking licenses, telecom concessions, construction contracts, education exchanges, religious partnerships. Morocco wasn't exporting ideology or troops, it was exporting companies. Moroccan banks were the spearhead. Attijari Wafa Bank, Banque Populaire, and BMCE expanded aggressively into Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Benin, Cameroon, Gabon, and beyond. These banks didn't just open offices, they financed local businesses, infrastructure, and trade. Over time, they embedded themselves deeply into national economies. Telecommunications followed. Maroc Telecom expanded across West Africa, acquiring operators and modernizing networks. Millions of Africans began using Moroccan-owned infrastructure without ever realizing it. Construction and real estate firms moved next. Moroccan companies built roads, housing projects, ports, and public buildings from Dakar to Kinshasa. These weren't aid projects. They were profitable contracts that locked Morocco into long-term economic relationships. Then came agriculture. Through OCP Group, Morocco leveraged its phosphate dominance into influence. Instead of simply exporting fertilizer, OCP partnered with African governments to build local fertilizer plants in Ethiopia and Nigeria, tailored to regional soil conditions. This tied African food security directly to Moroccan supply chains. This strategy did two things at once. It strengthened African agriculture and positioned Morocco as indispensable rather than extractive. While China focused on megaprojects and Europe focused on aid, Morocco focused on integration. The most symbolic moment came in 2017. After more than 3 decades away, Morocco rejoined the African Union. It had left in 1984 over disputes regarding Western Sahara, but Mohammed VI recognized that absence meant irrelevance. Upon rejoining, Morocco immediately began pushing for economic integration, investment frameworks, and political influence from within. By the early 2020s, Morocco had achieved something remarkable. It became one of Africa's largest investors, second only to South Africa in cumulative continental investment. Moroccan companies were operating in over 35 African countries. Few Africans viewed Morocco as a foreign power. Many viewed it as a partner. This wasn't accidental. Morocco emphasized cultural proximity, shared religion, and practical cooperation. The king sponsored religious training programs for African imams, reinforcing Morocco's soft power as a center of moderate Islam. Educational exchanges expanded. Airlines connected African capitals directly through Casablanca. Casablanca quietly became a financial and logistical hub linking Africa to Europe and the Middle East. This entire strategy unfolded while global attention focused elsewhere. Analysts watched China's Belt and Road Initiative, Gulf sovereign funds, and Western aid programs. Morocco's advance was incremental, commercial, and largely ignored. That invisibility was its strength. By the time observers noticed, Morocco was already embedded across the continent. This Africa pivot fundamentally changed Morocco's position. The country was no longer just a North African state dependent on European demand. It was now a continental connector, controlling financial flows, infrastructure, and trade routes across regions that would define global growth in the 21st century. But Africa was only one side of the equation. To convert influence into power, Morocco still needed something else: industrial scale. The industries that changed everything: cars, aerospace, and the manufacturing bet. By the early 2000s, Morocco had secured stability and expanded its influence across Africa. But influence alone does not create power. To truly change its economic position, Morocco needed something far more difficult to build: industrial capacity that could compete globally. For decades, Africa had been locked into a familiar pattern: export raw materials, import finished goods, depend on volatile commodity prices. Morocco decided to break that cycle. The turning point was manufacturing. Morocco understood a harsh truth about globalization. Countries do not move up the economic ladder by exporting resources alone. They move up by inserting themselves into global supply chains, especially those serving wealthy markets. For Morocco, that market was Europe. Geography, once again, became destiny. Morocco sits less than a day's shipping time from European ports. Trucks can reach Spain in hours. Ferries cross the Strait of Gibraltar constantly. Compared to Eastern Europe or Asia, Morocco offered proximity, speed, and lower costs. But proximity alone was not enough. The country needed skilled labor, political reliability, and trade access. So Morocco built all three. The automotive industry came first. In the early 2010s, Morocco made a calculated gamble by attracting major European car manufacturers. Renault was the first to commit at scale, opening a massive factory in Tangier. Stellantis followed, expanding production through Peugeot-branded facilities. These were not symbolic plants. They were fully integrated manufacturing hubs producing vehicles and components for export. Why Morocco? Labor costs were significantly lower than in Europe, but the workforce was more skilled and stable than in many emerging markets. Free trade agreements allowed Moroccan-made vehicles to enter the European Union with minimal barriers. Ports like Tangier Med enabled rapid shipment directly into European markets. Within a decade, Morocco became one of the largest vehicle exporters to Europe. Hundreds of thousands of cars rolled out of Moroccan factories each year. Automotive exports grew into one of the country's top sources of foreign currency, supporting entire ecosystems of suppliers, logistics firms, and training centers. This success changed perceptions. Morocco was no longer just assembling goods. It was manufactured at scale. Then came aerospace. At first glance, aerospace seems like an unlikely industry for a developing country. Precision manufacturing, strict safety standards, complex supply chains. But Morocco identified a niche: components. Rather than trying to build aircraft, Moroccan firms focused on producing parts, wiring systems, fuselage sections, structural components. These parts feed into global supply chains serving companies like Boeing, Airbus, and Bombardier. Specialized industrial zones emerged near Casablanca. Training programs partnered with European firms. Over time, Morocco built a reputation for reliability in one of the world's most demanding industries. By the early 2020s, Morocco's aerospace sector was growing at double-digit rates annually. Thousands of skilled jobs were created. Engineers, technicians, and managers gained expertise that could not be easily relocated elsewhere. Manufacturing did not stop there. Textiles and apparel moved up the value chain. Morocco shifted from basic garment assembly to fast fashion production serving European brands. Short turnaround times became Morocco's advantage. Designers in Europe could launch products manufactured in Morocco and stocked in stores within weeks. Electronics, food processing, and chemical manufacturing expanded alongside. Phosphates remained central, but Morocco changed how it used them. Instead of exporting raw phosphate rock, the country invested heavily in processing facilities that converted minerals into finished fertilizer products. This captured more value domestically and reduced exposure to commodity price swings. By moving up the value chain, Morocco transformed a colonial-era extraction industry into a modern industrial asset. What made this industrial expansion different was coordination. Industrial zones were placed near ports, training programs aligned with employer needs, infrastructure investment followed manufacturing demand rather than political favoritism. This reduced friction and increased efficiency. Foreign investors noticed. European companies saw Morocco as a near-shore alternative to Asia. Gulf investors saw a stable manufacturing base with access to Europe and Africa. Even Asian firms began exploring Morocco as a gateway into Western markets. But industrial growth alone was not enough. Factories need workers, workers need mobility, businesses need logistics, tourism needs access. Morocco needed infrastructure on a scale Africa rarely attempted. And that leads directly to the next phase. Infrastructure as power. High-speed rail, ports, airports, and physical integration. By the time Morocco's manufacturing strategy began to work, the country faced a new constraint. Industry can only grow as fast as infrastructure allows. Factories mean nothing if goods move slowly, tourism stalls if airports are congested, investment dries up if logistics are unreliable. Morocco understood this earlier than most. Instead of treating infrastructure as a political trophy, the state treated it as an economic weapon. The most visible symbol of this shift came in 2018, when Morocco launched Africa's first high-speed rail line. The train connected Tangier to Casablanca, cutting travel time between the two cities to just over 2 hours, while running at speeds comparable to those in Europe and East Asia. This was not a prestige project. It was a signal. Tangier is Morocco's industrial and port gateway. Casablanca is its financial and commercial center. Linking the two meant workers could move faster, executives could travel same day, and supply chains could operate with European-level efficiency. Morocco was collapsing distance inside its own borders. Critics immediately asked the obvious question: why would a developing country invest billions in high-speed rail? The answer was simple. Infrastructure creates economic gravity. Once the rail line opened, investment followed the tracks. Industrial zones expanded, property values rose, tourism increased. The rail line paid dividends not just in tickets sold, but in productivity gained. And Morocco did not stop there. The rail network is now being extended south toward Marrakesh and eventually Agadir, tying together Morocco's Atlantic corridor. The goal is national integration, not isolated growth. Ports became the second pillar. Tangier Med was designed to be more than a port. It was built as a global logistics hub. Located near the Strait of Gibraltar, it sits directly on one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. From Tangier Med, ships can reach Europe in days, West Africa in weeks, and the Americas without detours. The port expanded in phases, each one increasing capacity and efficiency. Today, it handles millions of containers annually and competes with major Mediterranean ports. Multinational firms use it as a distribution center for Europe and Africa simultaneously. But Tangier Med was not an exception. Morocco invested in dozens of ports along both the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. Casablanca, Agadir, Nador, and Dakhla all received upgrades. The objective was redundancy and resilience. No single choke point, no single failure risk. Airports followed. Morocco recognized that modern economies move people as much as goods. Airports across the country were expanded, modernized, and integrated into a national strategy. Casablanca's Mohammed V International Airport became a hub connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Royal Air Maroc repositioned itself as a connector airline, funneling African passengers through Casablanca to global destinations. This was deliberate. Every transit passenger generates economic activity: hotels, services, maintenance, logistics. Over time, Casablanca began to function like a mid-tier global hub rather than a regional endpoint. Roads completed the picture. Morocco invested heavily in highways, linking major cities and rural regions. Thousands of kilometers of roads were built or upgraded, connecting isolated villages to markets and services. This mattered because Morocco is geographically complex. The Atlas Mountains divide regions. For centuries, geography limited economic integration. Infrastructure erased those barriers. Farmers gained access to urban markets. Children reached schools. Businesses expanded beyond local boundaries. Economic participation widened. This physical integration changed Morocco internally, as much as it changed external perceptions. Investors noticed something critical. Projects were completed on time. Systems worked. Maintenance followed construction. In a region where infrastructure often decays quickly, Morocco's assets endured. This credibility attracted capital. Infrastructure also reinforced Morocco's geopolitical position. Europe gained a reliable southern logistics partner. Africa gained a northern gateway that was not controlled by former colonial powers or distant actors. Morocco was no longer just connected to the world. It was becoming essential to how the world moved. But infrastructure alone does not guarantee future relevance. Energy does, and Morocco faced a serious vulnerability: the energy bet. Renewables, power independence, and the green pivot. For all of Morocco's progress in industry and infrastructure, one vulnerability remained impossible to ignore: energy. Morocco has almost no oil and very little natural gas. For decades, this meant dependence on imports, exposure to global price shocks, and a constant drain on foreign currency reserves. Energy dependence limits sovereignty. Morocco decided to change that. Instead of searching for fossil fuels it did not have, Morocco focused on what it did have in abundance: sun, wind, space, and proximity to Europe. The result was one of the most ambitious renewable energy strategies in the developing world. The centerpiece of this strategy is solar power. In the desert near Ouarzazate, Morocco built the Noor Solar Complex, one of the largest concentrated solar power facilities on Earth. This was not a symbolic installation. It spans thousands of hectares and uses mirrors to concentrate sunlight, generating electricity even after sunset through thermal storage. The message was clear. Morocco was not experimenting, it was committing. Along the Atlantic coast, where winds are strong and consistent, Morocco built massive wind farms. These installations now stretch across coastal regions and elevated terrain, producing reliable power year-round. Wind and solar together began replacing imported fossil fuels in the national grid. Morocco set a clear target: generate more than half of its electricity from renewable sources by 2030. That goal is not aspirational, it is operational. By the mid-2020s, Morocco had already crossed the 40% threshold, placing it far ahead of most countries at a similar income level. This transition reshaped Morocco's economic calculations. Energy imports declined, exposure to oil price volatility decreased, electricity costs stabilized, but the most important change was strategic. Morocco stopped thinking of energy as a liability and started treating it as leverage. Europe faces a structural energy problem. It is heavily industrialized, politically committed to decarbonization, and increasingly constrained by geopolitics. Reliable, clean energy is scarce. Morocco sits just across the Strait of Gibraltar, closer to Europe than many European energy sources. Morocco began positioning itself as a future exporter of renewable energy. Plans emerged to connect Moroccan solar and wind capacity to Europe through undersea cables. The idea was simple but powerful. Produce clean energy where land and sunlight are abundant. Export it to markets where demand and prices are high. This vision attracted international attention. Green hydrogen projects followed. Morocco began developing capacity to produce hydrogen using renewable electricity, targeting European industries seeking to decarbonize steel, chemicals, and transport. These projects promised not only energy exports, but industrial ecosystems built around clean power. Manufacturers took notice. For companies seeking low-carbon supply chains, Morocco became increasingly attractive. Automotive and aerospace firms could manufacture goods using renewable energy, reducing emissions while maintaining proximity to European markets. Morocco turned environmental pressure into competitive advantage. This green pivot also reinforced Morocco's political image. The country positioned itself as a responsible, forward-looking state rather than a resource-dependent exporter. Climate diplomacy became another channel of soft power. But renewable energy alone does not guarantee prosperity. Large-scale transformation requires people, services, and global visibility. That visibility was about to arrive, and it would arrive through football. Football, soft power, and the AFCON rehearsal for the World Cup. By the mid-2020s, Morocco had built stability, industry, infrastructure, and energy capacity. But power is not only about economics, it is also about perception. Countries rise faster when the world starts paying attention, and Morocco understood that visibility accelerates influence. Football became the catalyst. In global terms, football is not just a sport. It is one of the most powerful tools of soft power ever created. It moves people, capital, media attention, and national narratives at a scale few events can match. Morocco did not stumble into this realization. It planned for it. When Morocco secured the right to host the Africa Cup of Nations, it treated the tournament not as an end goal, but as a systems test. AFCON was a rehearsal, a stress test for transport, security, logistics, broadcasting, tourism, and public administration. Hosting AFCON required upgrades across multiple cities. Stadiums in Rabat, Casablanca, Tangier, Marrakesh, Fez, and Agadir were rebuilt or modernized to international standards. These were not temporary venues. They were designed for long-term use, integrated into urban redevelopment plans rather than isolated megastructures. Transport systems were upgraded to handle surges in movement. Rail schedules were optimized. Roads were expanded. Airports were modernized. Hotels were built or renovated. The objective was not just to host teams and fans, but to demonstrate national coordination under pressure. Security was another priority. Morocco invested heavily in surveillance, crowd management, and emergency response capabilities. Successful event security sends a powerful message to investors and governments alike. This is a country that can manage complexity. AFCON also served a symbolic role. It positioned Morocco as an African host capable of delivering events previously associated with Europe or the Gulf. For African audiences, it projected competence and ambition. For international audiences, it challenged outdated assumptions about African capacity. But AFCON was never the real prize. The real target was 2030. Morocco's successful bid to co-host the FIFA World Cup alongside Spain and Portugal marked a turning point. This was not just about football prestige, it was geopolitical recognition. The World Cup is awarded to countries that FIFA believes can deliver infrastructure, stability, and global coordination. Morocco had tried and failed multiple times in previous decades. This time, it succeeded. The scale of preparation reflects how seriously Morocco is taking the opportunity. The centerpiece is the planned Grand Stade de Casablanca, also known as the Mohammed VI Stadium. Designed to hold more than 100,000 spectators, it is set to become the largest football stadium in the world. This alone is a statement of intent, but it is only one piece of a much larger investment. High-speed rail extensions are planned to connect host cities, allowing fans, teams, and officials to move quickly across the country. Airports are being expanded to handle dramatically higher passenger volumes. Roads and highways are being upgraded to ensure redundancy and reliability. Tourism infrastructure is scaling rapidly. Tens of thousands of new hotel rooms are planned. Hospitality training programs are expanding. Airlines are increasing fleets and routes. Morocco is positioning itself to absorb millions of additional visitors annually, not just during the World Cup, but long after it ends. The projected investment runs into the tens of billions of dollars. This has sparked debate. Critics argue that Morocco is overextending itself. Public debt is significant. Youth unemployment remains high. Rural poverty and inequality persist. They question whether stadiums should take priority over schools and hospitals. These concerns are real. But the government's argument is strategic. Infrastructure does not disappear after tournaments end. Rail lines continue to move workers. Airports continue to attract tourists. Hotels continue to employ people. Cities upgraded for global events tend to remain more competitive for decades. Morocco is not betting on football alone. It is using football as a multiplier. Each World Cup match brings global broadcasting, tourism revenue, sponsorship, and long-term branding. For a country seeking to reposition itself globally, this exposure is invaluable. There's also a diplomatic dimension. Co-hosting with Spain and Portugal integrates Morocco directly into a European project. It reinforces Morocco's role as a bridge between continents rather than a peripheral state. Football, in this context, becomes the visible proof of everything Morocco has built quietly for decades. The world will not see the spreadsheets, the industrial zones, or the policy frameworks. It will see packed stadiums, efficient transport, modern cities, and seamless organization. And perception matters. Because, after visibility, comes leverage, debt, risk, and the question. Everyone is asking, can Morocco afford this? By this point in the story, one question becomes unavoidable. Can Morocco actually afford what it's doing? Because ambition is impressive, but ambition without limits can destroy countries. Morocco is not a rich nation by global standards. Its economy is growing, but it is not massive. Public debt sits at levels that make economists uneasy. Youth unemployment remains stubbornly high. Rural inequality has not disappeared. And recent shocks, including droughts and earthquakes, have exposed real vulnerabilities. So when Morocco announces tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment tied to major global events, critics immediately raise red flags. They argue that Morocco is repeating a familiar mistake, that megaprojects benefit elites while ordinary citizens struggle, that stadiums do not educate children or treat patients, that debt taken today will burden future generations. These criticisms are not theoretical. They are grounded in real experiences across the developing world, where mega events have often left countries with white elephants and empty promises. Brazil, Greece, South Africa. Morocco's leadership knows this history very well, which is why the Moroccan strategy is not built on one giant bet, but on layered risk management. First, financing. Unlike countries that fully fund projects through public debt, Morocco has structured its investments using mixed financing. Public funds cover strategic infrastructure. Private capital is brought in where revenue generation is possible. International institutions, including development banks, share risk rather than transferring it entirely to the state. This spreads exposure. Second, sequencing. Morocco did not begin with stadiums. It built ports first, rail second, industrial zones third, energy fourth. The events come last. This matters because the infrastructure serving the World Cup already has economic purpose beyond football. High-speed rail is not being built solely for fans. It serves commuters, businesses, and logistics every day. Airports expanded for 2030 will continue handling tourists and trade for decades. Hotels will not vanish when the tournament ends. In other words, the projects are multi-use by design. Third, scale control. Morocco is not trying to host the entire World Cup alone. Co-hosting with Spain and Portugal dramatically reduces burden while preserving exposure. The largest costs are spread across 3 economies rather than one. This alone changes the risk equation. Fourth, timing. Morocco is not building into a stagnant economy. It is building into momentum. Manufacturing exports are rising. Tourism is expanding. Renewable energy investment is accelerating. The state is betting that growth will absorb debt rather than be crushed by it. That bet is not guaranteed, but it is calculated. The most serious risk Morocco faces is not debt alone. It is social pressure. Youth unemployment remains high, particularly among university graduates. Many young Moroccans see global images of prosperity while struggling to find stable work. If growth does not translate into opportunity, frustration will rise. The government is aware of this. Infrastructure projects are labor-intensive. Industrial expansion creates mid-skill jobs. Tourism absorbs large numbers of workers. These sectors are not accidental choices. They are employment engines. Still, there's no margin for complacency. A global recession, a collapse in European demand, a spike in energy prices, political instability in the region. Any of these could strain Morocco's model. There is also the Western Sahara issue. Morocco's claim over the territory remains disputed internationally, despite growing diplomatic recognition. Tensions with Algeria persist. A serious escalation could disrupt trade, investment, and regional integration. Morocco's leadership is betting that economic integration and diplomatic alignment will outweigh geopolitical risk. This is where the story becomes genuinely uncertain. Morocco is not guaranteed success, but what separates Morocco from many peers is awareness of risk. The strategy is not reckless expansion. It is controlled acceleration. The country is attempting something rare in the developing world. Using infrastructure not as spectacle, but as leverage. Using events not as distraction, but as amplification. Using geography not as destiny, but as strategy. The next question is not whether Morocco has risks. It does. The real question is whether Morocco's rise changes how power works in Africa. And that brings us to the final lens. What does superpower actually mean in the African context? What superpower really means, Western Sahara, and where Morocco goes next. When people hear the word superpower, they usually think of size, big population, massive military, huge economy. In Africa, that definition points to countries like Nigeria, South Africa, or Egypt. Morocco does not beat them on those metrics. That is not the game Morocco is playing. In the modern world, power is less about dominance and more about positioning. The countries that matter most are often the ones that connect regions, shape flows, and remain stable while others fluctuate. By that definition, Morocco's rise makes far more sense. Morocco sits at the hinge point between Europe and Africa. It is close enough to Europe to integrate economically, yet deeply embedded across Africa through finance, trade, infrastructure, and diplomacy. Few African countries can claim that dual access. Morocco does not export ideology, it exports reliability. European companies see Morocco as a nearshore manufacturing base. African governments see it as a partner rather than a patron. Gulf states see it as a politically stable investment destination. The United States sees it as a dependable regional ally. This is an influence built quietly, without confrontation. One of the clearest examples of this influence is how Morocco has navigated one of its most sensitive issues, Western Sahara. Western Sahara has been disputed since the mid-1970s, when Spain withdrew and Morocco asserted sovereignty over the territory. The issue has remained unresolved for decades, fueling tensions with Algeria and shaping regional politics. For many years, this dispute limited Morocco's diplomatic reach, particularly within Africa. Morocco changed its approach. Instead of relying solely on military or ideological arguments, it embedded Western Sahara into its broader economic strategy. Infrastructure investments expanded southward. Ports, roads, and renewable energy projects were developed in the region. Cities like Dakhla were positioned as gateways to West Africa rather than contested outposts. At the same time, Morocco pursued diplomatic recognition incrementally. In 2020, the United States formally recognized Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara as part of a broader geopolitical realignment. While the issue remains internationally complex, Morocco's position strengthened significantly. More importantly, Morocco reduced the issue's ability to isolate it. African countries that do business with Moroccan banks, ports, and fertilizer suppliers have fewer incentives to oppose Moroccan interests. Economic integration diluted political resistance. This is modern power. Not coercion, not domination, but alignment. Morocco's strategy also reflects an understanding of time. It does not seek instant transformation. It plans in decades. Ports built today serve trade flows 30 years from now. Energy projects initiated now shape industrial competitiveness for generations. Even the World Cup fits this pattern. It is not an endpoint, it is a milestone. A moment when everything Morocco has built becomes visible to the world. By 2030, Morocco aims to host millions more tourists annually, export higher value manufactured goods, integrate deeper into African economies, and supply clean energy beyond its borders. None of this is guaranteed. Debt remains a risk. Climate pressures will intensify, social demands will grow louder, but trajectory matters. 50 years ago, Morocco was a poor, post-colonial state extracting raw materials for others. 25 years ago, it was stable but peripheral. Today, it is central to conversations about African growth, European supply chains, and renewable energy futures. Morocco is not Africa's largest power. It may never be, but it is becoming one of Africa's most strategically important. And in a world defined by connections rather than conquests, that kind of power often matters more than raw size. Morocco is not waiting for permission. It is not waiting for aid. It is building quietly, deliberately, and on its own terms. And that is why, while much of the world is looking elsewhere, Morocco is steadily positioning itself as one of the most influential countries on the African continent. Not through noise, but through leverage,